David Cameron this morning on Laura Kuenssberg asks some basic questions about whether or not Hamas should be defined by the BBC as a terrorist organization. And he's really asking about the ambiguity of nomenclature. And he talks particularly about a man called Popplewell. And this man was featured, Nadav Popplewell, was featured on a Hamas video. He'd been captured with his mother in Kibbutz Nearim on the 7th of October, and he was then featured with a black eye, confirming his name. And then yet, hours later, Hamas released a second video in which they said that he died of his wounds because of an Israeli missile strike in Gaza. And the Foreign Office in Britain, because this man is also a British citizen, is struggling to work out what has happened. And David Cameron talks to Laura Kuenssberg this morning about the callous militants playing with the family's emotions. Maybe it's a moment actually for the BBC to ask itself again, should we describe these people as terrorists? They are terrorists. And the problem is, we want to see things in strict black and white. But that isn't the world. And I think we need to make it very clear. Hamas is a terrorist organization and a prescribed terrorist organization. And we should definitely refer to the October the 7th attack as a terrorist attack. We should definitely refer to the capture of the hostages as a terrorist action, and the continued retention of the hostages as terrorism. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't at the same time also be prepared and capable of calling for peace in Gaza, of calling for a recognition of the Palestinian state, of calling for a two-state solution. It doesn't mean that while saying that Israel has a right to defend itself, we shouldn't criticize Netanyahu in the strongest possible terms for the way that he's interpreted this right in a way that comes very close. In fact, I think crosses the line into being wrong. And his attack, his threatened attack, wholesale attack on Rafah, the last refuge of the Palestinian people gathered in Gaza, is simply abhorrent. But it demonstrates the inability of Netanyahu's policy. It demonstrates the stupidity of that policy and how that policy is not going to restore the hostages to their families and to the former life that they had enjoyed. And all the time, people are talking about peace and yet doing quite the opposite. You cannot be saying one thing on the one hand and doing something else. Words are there to aid clarity. Words are there because they give distinction to concepts. And so if we are going to distort the meaning of words, rather than using two words which may seem to conflict, but maybe we can reconcile that conflict, then we are in the land of deceit rather than the land of truth and in the land of reality. And this is why I think the politics of today is ill-suited to deal with a major crisis like the Hamas crisis and like the Ukraine crisis, because the deceit comes so quickly to the forefront. And the heartbreak that the hostages' families are going through, the fear that the hostages must be going through, at the hands of thugs who are terrorists. Now, is it possible? So yesterday there was the Israeli ambassador to the UN talked about the possibility of a Palestine led by Hamas leaders. I don't see that as being utterly impossible. I don't see that as being equally. I don't see that as being an appalling thought. I don't think it's a desirable thought. But I don't see it as different to Israel being led by Menachem Begin, whose hands were drenched in terrorist activity. People can have a Damascene conversion. People can change from the bomb to the ballot box. And surely that's something that we encourage. While we might judge somebody on their past record, we can hope for change. And signals of change are surely signals that we should embrace and signals we should encourage. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be critical, for example, of Natalie Elphicke or even of Dan Poulter. But I am suggesting that we should be prepared to accept that change is possible in this strange world. And that change does not mean that we start to define something which we recognize as wholly wrong, like terrorism, as something that is right. Hamas is not Palestine, just as Netanyahu is not Israel, just as Israel is not Judaism. These words are not interchangeable, just as Putin, despite all his claims, is not Russia. We need to see beyond the deception of those in power.